Hello class, this is Chapter 9, the Russian domain for Geography of World Regions. I'm Wade Renando, and this chapter is about Russia and some of the nearby countries that are influenced by Russia. These countries include Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and Georgia. The northern half of Eurasia is the northern half of the Eurasian Peninsula is this region. It basically goes from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. It has had rapid political and economic change since the end of the Cold War. And it is a country that continues to go through transition as it moves away from its communist past and adopts a more capitalistic present and future. This is an area that has a vast wilderness. The western parts of Russia is called Siberia, and this has a very low population, lots of coniferous forests, lots of natural resources, and it's benefited historically through trade from fur and gold and other natural resources, and it also has the longest transnational railroad in the world, which we'll be talking about in a little bit, the Siberian Railway. So the Soviet Union is what used to be part of Russia, or I should say Russia used to be part of the Soviet Union along with numerous other countries that dissolved in the late 1980s, early 1990s, but the region still has a persistent Russian influence in it. And recently, since the end of the Cold War, there's been some countries that have broken away from Russian influence and looked more towards the West, such as Poland, and some countries that have remained under close Russian influence, and then some countries like Ukraine that are split, some of whom would like to stay within the Russian sphere of influence, and some would like to look more to the West towards Europe as an example of who they want to have close relations with. In this picture, the OKO Tower is the tall residential building with the blue banner in the middle, and that is one of the largest residential buildings in Europe. It is 1,160 feet high, 90 floors tall, and that opened in 2015. That just shows some of the very rapid growth that downtown Moscow has been going through in the last 15 to 20 years as the economy grows. And in addition to Russia and Moscow, some of the outlying countries are also going through significant change. This is a picture of Chisinau, the capital of the nearby country of Moldova, and some of the countries have industrialized and become more capitalistic better than others. Some of them are still very dependent on one type of economy or one product or one thing that they focus on. They haven't as successfully diversified as they would like. And Russia also has large numbers of people in this region of what are sometimes called oligarchs. And these are very wealthy people with a lot of significant influence, some of whom were able to take advantage of the disintegration of the Soviet Union when lots of state-run enterprises were sold off to the private sector. Some people took advantage of some of these state-run institutions and bought them at less than they were probably worth. And there are a large number of very wealthy people in Russia and in this region, sometimes called oligarchs, not unlike perhaps we have here with Bill Gates or Bezos or so on. And many of them who made their money in Russia made their money off of the disintegration of the Soviet Union when a lot of state assets were sold off. So this is an example of the physical geography and environment of the region. This region, the Russia and its domain is a vast region. It includes, of course, the country of Russia and then also some of the other countries that we mentioned earlier, mostly in the east, Ukraine, Moldova, and others here. But it's dominated by the country of Russia. And roughly the eastern third of Russia, I'm sorry, the western third of Russia is considered to be in Europe, roughly this third, and the eastern third is considered to be in Asia, and the dividing line are the Ural Mountains right here. So everything this way is considered to be Asia, and everything to the west is considered to be Europe. And it is a climate that is largely what's classified as D, which means 4 distinct seasons with warm summers, cold winters, and falls, and so on. And a large portion of the region is far away from the moderating effects of the ocean. So it has a climate similar to Michigan and the northern Midwest. Siberia is actually quite dry in some places, drier than you might think. The amount of rain and snowfall is relatively light, but overall it's a cold region during the winter, but it does have warm summers in most parts, and actually fairly fertile land in the eastern part of the western part of the region that is near Europe or in Europe. So it does have some very productive farmland. And then in the north it has lots of tundra and boreal forests a little bit south of the tundra. And again, this is an example of the climate breakdowns of this region. D-continental mid-latitude climates dominate the region, and a little bit south of those you'll often have dry climates, mid-latitude steppes on the southern parts of the region, and then in the very north you have polar climates, largely tundra and then some ice caps, but overwhelmingly a continental climate. So European western section of this region is a little milder than the drier and colder Siberia further to the east. European Russia includes the eastern roughly third of Russia plus Belarus and Ukraine. This is an area that has large rivers, large canals, and many productive rivers that can be used to move freight around. Cold winters and mostly cool summers, again similar to the climate here in Michigan. Colder temperatures to the north, but warmer temperatures as you go south, and some variation in the soil quality. Some soil is very productive, some of it is somewhat acidic, but large portions of the eastern part of this region have very productive farmland that doesn't look a lot different than the Midwest or Wisconsin. And then the dividing line between Europe and what's considered Asia would be the Ural Mountains. These are mountains that are about as tall as the Appalachian Mountains. They're not as tall as the Rockies. They peak at about 6,000 feet or so. It is relatively low and contains a lot of valuable minerals. And then as you get further north in this region, you have, as you can see in the middle picture, a tundra. And then as you get a little further south in this region, you have a boreal forest. The Ural Mountains are about 1,500 miles long. Most of the peaks average about 3,000 to 4,000 feet. The highest peak is 6,200 feet. So similar to the Appalachians, maybe a little bit taller than that. Interestingly, during World War II, a lot of the Soviet Union moved much of their industrial base to the east of the Ural Mountains to keep it safe from German attacks. So a lot of the war efforts and a lot of the tanks that were manufactured by the Soviet Union were moved to the east of the mountains to try to protect them from attack, and that was somewhat successful. This is a picture of a taiga. Again, a taiga is the same thing as a boreal forest or an evergreen forest. It's a forest that's made up mostly of pine trees and coniferous trees that have cones and needles. And then north of that is the tundra. Parts of northern Canada look similar to this. Cold, very little growth except for because of the short growing season, stubby grass. This is a picture of a musk ox on the Russian tundra. And there's little vegetation simply because long winters make it difficult for things to grow due to a lack of light, and some of the area is quite dry and also cold, so it significantly limits what vegetation can grow, and that limits what life is there. Interestingly enough, Russia to the very far east has a very interesting and unique ecosystem. It seems somewhat like the Pacific Northwest, perhaps like Seattle or British Columbia. It has a moderating effect from the Pacific Ocean, and it has a very interesting variety of fauna or animals. It is an area, really the only area in the world, where you will have leopards and tigers and reindeer or caribou, as they call them, and bears in the same environment. Although the leopards and tigers are rare, their numbers have been dropped significantly. Nonetheless, this is a very interesting and unique region, somewhat like the Pacific Northwest, with a very wide variety of fascinating animals living together like you wouldn't see anywhere else in the world. So ecologically diverse, mostly coniferous forests, and also some hardwoods mixing together. And there's the fertile valleys also. The Amur Valley and the Usri Valley is very fertile with good farmland. This region also has the Kamchatka Peninsula. That's this peninsula that juts out into the Pacific Ocean, similar to the latitude in what southern Alaska would be. And it's very lightly populated, lots of forests, lots of bears and salmon runs that are undisturbed, and it's trying to market itself as a tourist attraction, a tourist destination. It's so remote, though, it doesn't have a whole lot of tourists, but it is trying to change that. So that's the Kamchatka Peninsula. It's very beautiful, very rugged, similar to what parts of Alaska might look like. The Caucasus and Transcaucasia region is an area that is in between the Black and Caspian Sea, and they have the Caucasus Mountains in this region, which are very tall mountains, about on par with the Rockies, some of which are up to 18,000 feet. In fact, the tallest mountain in this range is Mount Elbrus, and that is 18,510 feet. That is comparable to some of the tallest mountains in the lower 48. This region is very diverse, with lots of variation in topography, meaning elevation, has some flat terrain, some low hills, very tall mountains, and complex climate patterns as well. So this area in between these two seas is mountainous and very diverse in the kind of climate it has. So agriculture in this region is somewhat limited as you get further east, again, because it is mostly tundra and taiga. But as you get further to the west, there's diversified agriculture, as you can see in orange here, which would mean a combination of wheat and corn, soybeans, similar to what we would have in the Midwest. Then as you get a little bit south of that, you have large-scale grain production, mostly wheat. And then you have some urban tract farming, and also some humid subtropical specialized agricultural production along the Black Sea. What that often means is grapes grown for vineyards, perhaps olive gardens. So in the western quarter or so, there is some productive farmland, and in some of the parts along the Russian-Chinese border, there's some diversified agriculture too. But most of this region is tundra and taiga or evergreen forest. So this is a region that has been severely and detrimentally affected by pollution because of mass industrialization. And this is a legacy of the Soviet Union. Under communism, of course, people had no individual property rights. Everything was owned by the state. And because of that, people couldn't sue to prevent a factory from going into a fight against pollution. And the air and water quality in the region is quite poor. The USSR was around for about 70 years, and in order to win World War II, there was rapid industrialization. And after World War II, the Cold War continued, and the Soviet Union continued to have a large military presence. And because of that, they had lots of industry with very little controls on pollution. And this legacy of pollution is around even to this day. This is Norilsk. This is pictures of a nickel factory, and those are known for being a very major sources of pollution. These are some of the environmental issues facing the region. In 1986, there was a nuclear accident in Chernobyl that was the worst nuclear accident in history, and it killed dozens of people and caused nuclear pollution and contamination to spread. It has been largely contained, but it's still a major concern. In the north, an area called Nova Zemlya has been an unregulated dumping ground for nuclear waste for decades. And we talked about earlier, Norilsk is a Siberian town that's one of the most polluted on Earth. There's been issues of deforestation and out-of-control wildfires in parts of Siberia. And Lake Baikal, one of the largest and deepest freshwater lakes in the world, contains about 20% of the Earth's frozen fresh water. But it has also been suffering from pollution from factories, specifically paper factories. So it's an area that has dealt with the legacy of pollution from the Soviet era. There's also issues of salinization, which, as we discussed, is when salt builds up in the soil, making it difficult or impossible to farm. This is the Kamchatka Peninsula that we talked about earlier. Right there, goes out into the Pacific Ocean. And this is some more example of air pollution. These are pictures of Moscow. Moscow has fairly polluted air, although it's nowhere as bad as Beijing or New Delhi. And they still have a lot of coal-fired power plants. And they also have a tremendous amount of traffic caused by cars and pollution. Moscow has traffic jams that can possibly even put LA to shame. It's pretty bad. You can see here, I mean, there's like 20 lanes of traffic. Most of these roads and most of these cars are fairly new. Under communism, there weren't nearly as much traffic congestion because people didn't own that many cars. But traffic jams in Moscow can sometimes last 2 to 2.5 hours, and there's problems with peat fires also contributing to pollution in Moscow. So it is an area, like many parts of the world, that's dealing with the negative effects of cars and coal-fired power plants and pollution. Water pollution, again, is a major problem. Water supplies are vulnerable to industrial pollution. Sometimes raw sewage and oil or natural gas can leak into lakes and seas. They had very few laws protecting the environment. Industrialization hurt the quality of Lake Baikal ever since the 50s. And the picture on the bottom right is of pulp paper factories that poured waste into the Lake Baikal. Manufacturing paper is actually surprisingly polluting. A lot of harsh chemicals are used in order to mix the wood into pulp and eventually into paper. So paper factories can lead to lots of pollution. So I mentioned earlier there was a nuclear accident at the Chernobyl nuclear plant. The Soviet Union nuclear program ignored environmental safety, and the Chernobyl nuclear accident occurred on April 26, 1986, near the town of Pripyat in Ukraine. During the accident itself, 31 people died, and the long-term negative effects in the region were also very severe. Higher rates of cancer for people living near the area. The old nuclear reactor is also contaminated river with plutonium leaks. So now this area is a ghost town. Interestingly enough, there are occasional tourists who actually go and tour the area. If you're only there briefly, the long-term detrimental effects are minor. And there are even some older women who used to live in the area who have been moving back because it was their home before the nuclear accident. And so far, some of them have had relatively few overt effects caused by the nuclear contamination, but they moved back when they were relatively old, so the long-term detrimental effects might not have affected them yet. But this week there is a TED Talk that talks about the women who moved back to this area, who left during the mid-'80s, and how, at least so far, they don't seem to have too many detrimental effects of moving back into this nuclear contaminated area. And we mentioned earlier in the far north, some islands north of Siberia were used as nuclear dumping ground for toxic waste. 224 nuclear detonations were done in Novaya Zemlya. The U.S. did nuclear tests in parts of Nevada and the Southwest Desert, and in the same way, some of these very remote islands were used for testing nuclear weapons. And there's been unregulated dumping of nuclear waste, and a lot of old ships are simply left up there to rot because it's kind of a graveyard, a marine graveyard for old ships. So basically, these very remote islands in northern Siberia are a dumping ground for ships, pollution, and toxic waste. And of course, we mentioned a little earlier, Norilsk pollution. This is probably the most polluted city in the area. About 350,000 tons of sulfur oxide are emitted each year. Putin, after a tour of the city, said that he would increase fines on polluters to try to crack down on pollution, but so far it's still a very polluted city, one of the worst industrial polluted cities in the world. So addressing the environmental crisis, there has been a movement in Russia, like in much of the world, to try to clean up the pollution. A large sarcophagus was placed over the most contaminated part of Chernobyl to try to contain the radiation poisoning. There have been cleanup efforts in Lake Baikal, some of which have been grassroots organizations, and there have been some good news. A specific type of leopard, the Amur leopards, have started to come back to parts of eastern Russia where they were almost wiped out. But there's still a lot of work to do. A 32,000-ton steel concrete arch was placed over the damaged reactor. That's what this picture is on the bottom left in 2017, and that has helped contaminate some of the radioactive nuclear dust. But it's not exactly sure how long the arch will last and how much it will cost to maintain that arch. And a little bit more on Lake Baikal. This is a large lake that contains as much water as all of the Great Lakes combined. It's very deep. It's the largest freshwater lake in the world by volume. It contains more fresh water than all of North American Great Lakes combined. It is 5,387 feet deep at its deepest point. That's about a mile deep for a lake. That's incredibly deep. And about 55 million years old, one of the oldest lakes in the world. If you remember, the Great Lakes, Lake Superior, Huron, and so on, are only about 10 to 12,000 years old. They're relatively new lakes. They were created when the last ice age, all of the ice that covered the Midwest retreated and left these indentations that filled up with glacial water that became the Great Lakes. So the Great Lakes are relatively new, very new compared to some other lakes around the world. And this is interesting because Lake Baikal is the only lake in the world that has freshwater seals. Seals are always saltwater animals, but in Lake Baikal they have these freshwater seals that are endemic to the area, meaning unique to the area, and they have lots of other fish and other aquatic creatures that are only found in this specific lake. Here are some more pictures of Lake Baikal. It's generally a very beautiful lake. It's in a fairly rural part of Russia, and it has a tendency during the winter of having ice that turns incredibly deep blue. It reflects the air, and it's very clear and pure, and because of that, it often has a deep blue hue to it during the winter. So we talked a little bit more about some of the good news in this region when it comes to the environment. This is a picture of the Amur leopards. In 2007, there were only about 40 of these leopards left in the wild. They lived on the border between China and Russia in the far eastern part of Siberia. None in China or Korea were around, and only a small portion of these animals were alive in Russia. Conservation efforts have brought them back to 80, which might not sound like much, but it is still a doubling of the population. And 12 leopards were recently spotted living near China, so the numbers might be a little higher than that. So it's an example of how conservation efforts can help protect animals and bring back animals. And it also shows the unique kinds of animals that live in the very far part of Siberia. So climate change in Russia is a major issue. Compared to most regions, Russia probably has more to benefit from climate change than other regions. If you are in an area that's very dry, climate change might mean more droughts, more water scarcity. But in Russia, and in the northern parts of Russia especially, it might mean a longer growing season for food. It might mean a longer season for shipping that normally might be frozen over. So there have been some benefits of increased warmer temperatures in Russia compared to other regions, although they still have a lot of problems as well, like the loss of permafrost, which could cause buildings to cave in on the soil beneath them. So this is a picture of the northern sea route. You might have heard of the Northwest Passage. That is what Europeans were looking for centuries when they were trying to get from Europe past the Americas to Asia. They were looking for a route somewhere, anywhere around the Americas. They would go south of South America, then they would cross the Isthmus of Panama, and there is a Northwest Passage in the very northern part of Canada, but it's often iced over much of the year. And Russia has been hoping that there might be something called the Northeast Passage that would be opening up. And the idea is, if climate continues to get warmer, there will be a northern sea route that would allow ships to leave very northern cities in Russia, travel through the Bering Straits, and travel south to China, to Beijing and elsewhere, where they can get to some major markets where they can sell manufactured goods and raw materials to. So if global warming continues, there could be a significant increase in ships on the northern edge of Russia, where previously it simply would have been too cold and too frozen over for much of the year. So one of the very minor benefits of global warming for Russia is increased shipping in the Arctic Ocean. So climate change, of course, those are some of the benefits of climate change. There aren't many of them. And potential hazards include increased wildlife risk, Arctic and subarctic ecosystems changing, rising sea levels that could endanger cities along coasts, the thawing of Siberian permafrost, and the logging practices in the boreal forest. That's not necessarily caused by climate change, but much of Siberia has been logged like the Pacific Northwest, and it's been devastating to some of the natural environments of the area. So, like the American West, hotter climates have led to increased wildfires in Russia. 2016, Russia had a wildfire that was the size of Vermont and Delaware, very large. Many of the blazes started to burn villages, and the fire spread very quickly, and rising global temperatures are expected to make this a more serious problem. Moscow occasionally has smoke that comes from wildfires farther to the east that will whiff over the city. I have a sister-in-law that lives in San Francisco, and she has commented that the massive wildfires in California have blackened the skies or created smoke around the San Francisco Bay Area for a few days earlier this year. So wildfires can cause serious pollution for urban environments in addition to hurting the wilderness. And melting permafrost as temperatures get warmer, soil that is usually frozen all year round can thaw, and that can cause buildings that are built on top of it to collapse because the land underneath them starts to collapse. Melting permafrost could release also deadly pathogens that have been frozen in the ice. Some scientists are concerned that there might be viruses that people have no immunity to that are frozen in the permafrost, and if the climate gets warmer, some of these bacteria or viruses could be released in the form of colds or illnesses that we don't have much of an immunity to. So that's something that we're concerned with, many scientists are concerned with. So this is an interesting map that breaks down the world into different grids and shows the temperature changes throughout the world. As you can see in the bottom here, temperature change in average annual temperature from 1950 to 2006 in degrees Celsius. And the larger and redder the circles, the more the increase is. So a large red circle is more than 0.2 degrees. Smaller red circles is 0.1 to 0.2 degrees. And smaller is less than 0.1 degrees. That might not sound like a huge change. 0.2 degrees Celsius is perhaps about a half degree Fahrenheit. But nonetheless, it shows a very clear pattern where the Earth is getting significantly warmer almost all over the place with very few exceptions. And it's especially prevalent in parts of Siberia and in northern Russia and in the northern parts of the US and Canada as well. So warm climates have caused some problems in Russia also when it came to hosting the Winter Olympics. In 2014, the city of Sochi hosted the Olympics. It was an unusual place to have them because it's actually quite far south for hosting the Winter Olympics. It has a climate similar perhaps to Northern California. There are some large mountains near the city of Sochi that most of the Arctic events such as skiing were held, but nonetheless it was an Olympic that was plagued with problems. There was an unusual warm spell during this time, and a lot of the skiers up in the mountains complained that it was just too hot. It was up to 50 degrees or 55 degrees in the day, which is quite hot for an Olympic skier. And they had to add artificial snow at night when it just barely dipped below freezing. So there's barely enough snow to hold the Olympics. And in addition to that, there were also some problems with the quality of construction. A lot of people commented that the facilities were built rather quickly and poorly, and it kind of reflected poorly on Russia and made Russia look like they were a little disorganized. The Winter Olympics had topped $51 billion to host, and these are Winter Olympics. These aren't even the Summer Olympics, which are usually larger. And at the opening ceremony, one of the circles did not open completely like it was supposed to. The water was contaminated and yellowish, and journalists had a field day poking fun at this. It was kind of a disaster. Beijing is going to host the Winter Olympics, interestingly enough, in 2022. This is the only city, Beijing, that has hosted the Summer and Winter Olympics. They hosted the Summer Olympics in 2008. And this is also a city that's a little too warm to ideally host the Winter Olympics. So they might also have to make large amounts of artificial snow in order to host the Olympics. So here are some more examples of some of the rather odd, poor construction. Journalists would get into a hotel room and curtains would be hanging down. You'd have two toilets built in one stall. That was kind of funny. Wi-Fi connections were just dangling from the wall. It was kind of a mess. And there were a lot of very unusual toilets that people made fun of too. So journalists who are kind of used to being pampered and are used to being put into nice hotels, a lot of them were appalled at the poor conditions that they had to endure when they were covering the Olympics. And they went on Twitter and Instagram and they made sure everyone knew about it. Here's an interesting, funny, actual real sign at the Sochi Olympics explaining how to properly use toilets. Of course, you need to sit, you can't stand, you're not supposed to puke in it, can't fish in it, and I don't know what this guy's drinking by the toilet. I think this is especially hilarious. Sochi is explaining to people that you cannot fish in the toilet, so glad they cleared that up. So the population and demographics of this region, Russia and the other countries in the region have a population of about 200 million residents, fairly small compared to other world regions that we've talked about. Most of them live in cities. Population patterns include a large amount of natural resources for a relatively modest population, large chunks of the region that are almost complete wilderness. And in the areas that are populated, you often will have fairly large cities like Moscow. Moscow is a population about 13 million in the metropolitan area, slightly larger than London, probably about the same size as Istanbul, and one of the largest cities in Europe, if you consider it to be part of Europe. So London and Istanbul and Moscow are considered to be the largest cities in Europe. And then here on the bottom, you see a little chart that shows the population in millions. Russia is the largest at 144 million. And then Ukraine is the second largest at 42 million. Population density, relatively low population density for much of the countries. Moldova is a little higher. Rate of natural increase. This region is interesting because it has a very low, relatively low rate of natural increase. Pretty stable at 0 or 0.2. Total fertility rate, relatively low. In order to have a stable population, you need to have a total fertility rate of 2.1, meaning that a typical woman needs to have 2.1 children on average to keep the population stable. So anything below that, Armenia 1.5, Moldova 1.3, that means you would have a declining population if you did not have immigration, people moving into the country. So percent of urban, fairly high. Percent below 15, fairly low compared to other parts of the world. And rate of net migration, quite a few people moving out of Armenia, and a fair number of people moving into Russia from other countries seeking job opportunities in Russia. So not a huge amount of migration compared to other regions. A fair number of people leaving, exiting Armenia, and the others are roughly flat or 0. So population distribution, then you can clearly see from this choropleth map that most of the population is concentrated in the European part of the region to the west. Moscow's a large and growing city. Armenia has a fairly large population. This area here is the Caucasus region we talked about, in between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And that has a fairly high population density because of a good climate for growing crops and a good supply of water and a warmer climate. Population loss in Belarus. The population in Belarus peaked in 1993 and has been on the slow decline and now has a population of about 9.5 million, a little larger than Michigan. Moscow has been booming. Eastern Ukraine has had declining populations. There has been an outmigration due to the civil war in the Ukraine. And on the very far western part of the region, you have some cities that are growing fairly rapidly, but for the most part, the eastern part of the region is lightly populated compared to the western part. Yeah, Moscow has about 6 million people in the metropolitan area, about 11.5 in the city proper. I'm sorry, 16 million in the metropolitan area. The city itself has about 11 million, and then a couple million more in the suburbs. So very large metropolitan area. So some patterns of urban cities in this region are a little different than in the U.S. In the U.S. and North America, they have a very car-centric city where you had older cities in the north that grew before the mid-20th century, and then Sunbelt cities to the south like Atlanta and Las Vegas and Phoenix that grew very rapidly after World War II after cars became common, after freeways, after air conditioning. In this region, it's more of a centralized, denser city built around pedestrians and around mass transit. Compared to the United States, Moscow is a little different because Moscow does have large suburbs and more of a decentralized, sprawling city. But compared to North America, a little denser downtowns, more mass transit. And the picture on the top is of St. Petersburg. That is the second largest city in Russia. That's actually a fairly new city. It was founded in the early 1700s by Peter the Great, the Tsar of Russia. He wanted to have a city that was European and facing Europe and had access to the Baltic Sea. So he went to war briefly with Sweden, took land away from Sweden that had access to the Baltic Sea, and then built this large new capital, St. Petersburg. So it's very beautiful. Many of the buildings were built in the early to mid 1700s in Georgian or Baroque style. And then the picture on the left is Moscow from space. It looks like a large sprawling city. And then on the bottom right is the city of Kiev on the Dnieper River. And that has a lot of old medieval buildings in it. Kiev has about 2.8 million people. It's the seventh most populous city in this region. And it has a long history to it. So the Siberian hinterlands, we talked about some of the urban areas. Out in the hinterlands, the rural areas, there's a Trans-Siberian Railroad that links Moscow with the Pacific, and it's a very important lifeline for this region. This is also an area out to the east that is fairly seismically active. You can see the fault line here on the eastern part, and there are a fair number of earthquakes along this region. So this is an area that gets significantly less populated as you go further east. So the Trans-Siberian Railway goes from Moscow to Vladivostok, which is a large city on the Pacific. It's 5,772 miles long. It was built rather quickly between 1891 and 1916, and it's the largest rail line in the world, and it is still in the process of expanding. If you were to travel from Moscow all the way to the Pacific to the city of Vladivostok, it is about a 6-day journey. And they have some fairly comfortable cars. You have a person up on the right kind of relaxing in one of the beds. And I've heard some people, tourists like traveling it just for the fun of it, passing through Siberia and rural parts of Russia, kind of like traveling across the U.S. on Amtrak, except even further. So this is the longest rail line in the world, and it's a very important lifeline linking Moscow with the very far eastern part of Russia. Here are, we talked a little earlier about different migration patterns, how Moscow is generally a growing city, and how some of the more rural areas are losing populations. This shows migrations, Russian immigrants returning from former Soviet republics in orange. There are a lot of countries, sometimes called the Stan countries, that previously were part of the Soviet Union, but they became independent after the breakup of the Soviet Union in the late 80s, early 90s. And many ethnic Russians who were living in these areas have been moving back to Moscow, back to the western part of Russia. And there's a significant amount of migration, as you can see, in this region going to Moscow, and some migration of Russians leaving Moscow, going to Europe, going to the US, and going to Canada. So a lot of people in the region moving to Moscow, and people who have been in Russia for a long time leaving the area to go to the US, Canada, or other parts of Russia, or other parts of Europe. So regional migration patterns, again, in the 1500s, much like in the 1800s, European settlers moved west across the continent. The same thing happened in Russia in the 15 and 1600s. Ethnic Russians moved into Siberia, getting into conflict with natives and pushing them off their land. And this was called the Russification of the continent. Russians wanted to have access to very valuable fur. There were lots of animals, such as beaver, that had very expensive, valuable pelts. Beaver pelt was similar to a year's wages for someone who was working for low wages. So it was very valuable. And starting in the 15 and 1600s, Russia continued to press further eastward, coming into conflict with and displacing some native persons until they eventually reached the Pacific in the late early 1700s. And this movement of Russians, again, similar to movements of white settlers across North America, is called the Russification of the continent. Many immigrants in the former Soviet Republic have moved to Moscow. We talked a little bit about that earlier. We showed a picture of that. And here are some pictures of some of these immigrants, similar to how Latin American people have moved to the U.S., people from Kazakhstan, people from Tajikistan and other former parts of the Soviet Union have moved to Moscow. Some of them take low-wage jobs in service sectors, again, like some Latinos in parts of the U.S. Some of them live in less than perfect work conditions, and a large number of them are Muslim. About 11% of this region is Muslim, Russia and this region, most of them from former Soviet republics in Central Asia. Moscow specifically has about 12 to 15% of its city's population that are Muslim. Although, despite the fact that they have this large Muslim population, they only have 6 mosques. The city will not allow more mosques to be built, and because of that, these relatively small number of mosques attract a very large number of Muslim worshippers. And as you can see, the picture on the bottom right shows Muslims praying at one of the 6 mosques in Moscow down there. So you can see it's very crowded because of the small number of mosques and the large number of Muslims. Russia they're not particularly concerned, at least compared to the U.S., about Muslims invading their country, because Russia has had a long history of close contact with other regions of the world that are Muslim. Russia adopted Christianity in the Middle Ages. They chose to become Greek Orthodox, or Russian Orthodox, so basically Christians. But to the south, they'd had large regions that had been Muslims for centuries. So Russia has a long history of living in close contact with Muslim countries to their south. So inside the Russian city, we talked a little bit about how, at least compared to the U.S., it's a little more compact. Usually the downtown older part is more desirable, and as you get further away, you usually have less desirable housing, but not always. And in the 70s and 80s, there were large numbers of public housing units that were called microkanyons that were kind of like the Russian version of public housing. It was a way of providing cheap, affordable housing to the masses. Some of these buildings are still around. They're not particularly stylish. They're very functional, but in some cities like Moscow, people who live in them are still fairly happy to have them. So as you can see on the top right, this is some of the very rapid growth they've had in Moscow. Lots of construction cranes. And on the bottom right, these are a lot of single-family homes in the suburbs of Moscow, similar to what we'd have in the U.S. And then on the bottom left is a pedestrian plaza in downtown Moscow. So Moscow is a fairly wealthy city, and by some accounts considered to be a fairly pleasant place to live if you have the money. Some history there, some nice public parks and so on. So this is one of the nicer parks in there, Gorky Park. This is like the central park of New York in Moscow, and it has lots of formal gardens, and it is built on the Moskva River, opened in 1928. 300 acres, so it's not particularly large. Central Park, I think, is about 800 acres, and it's designed by a world-famous Soviet avant-garde architect named Kovenstan Melinkov. So that's sort of the premier park in Moscow. And we talked a little earlier about those large numbers of public housing. This is a picture of microkanyons from the air. Most of the buildings are about 10 to 15 stories tall, and they were built rather quickly. They're somewhat inexpensive, but utilitarian, not particularly glamorous. But then again, it did provide large numbers of housing for people, and I guarantee you there are a lot of people in New York City who would love to have an apartment like the one on the bottom right, because there's such a housing shortage there. So although it was very utilitarian and not very glamorous, it did do the job of providing large amounts of relatively inexpensive housing to a large number of people. So here's some more information about the urban landscape of Moscow. The metropolitan Moscow sprawls more than 50 miles beyond the city center, so it's a big sprawling area with an older city core and then an area that has grown, especially in the last 20 years, on the outside of it. The city itself is about 11 million people. More live in the suburbs. It has a relatively strong economy and has attracted lots of migrant workers from Central Asia. And one of the most interesting things is it has a very extensive subway system. The Moscow subway system is 204 miles long with 197 stations. It opened in 1935 with one 11-kilometer mile line, 6.8 mile line with 13 stations, and it has grown since then. During the 1930s, while the United States and much of the Western capitalistic world was in the midst of the Great Depression, Russia went on a massive public spending spree and built a lot of these extensive subways during that era. And they were trying to show that their economic system was better than the West's, because while the West was struggling with 25% unemployment rates in the US in the early 30s, Moscow was putting people to work building these big, beautiful subway systems. And the picture on the bottom right shows what a subway station in Russia looks like. They're usually very beautiful and glamorous because it's kind of a way of the state to show that they value the people. Look at how beautiful and glamorous these subway stations are. So while people's private property might be less glamorous than it is in the US, in the 1930s, Russia wanted to build very beautiful and ornate subway stations as kind of a way of building pride in the country and in their economic system. Here are some more pictures of the Moscow subway. The picture on the left shows the extent of the Moscow subway, and the pictures on the right show people using it. It's still very heavily used to this day. And it's beautifully and ornately decorated in some of the stations. So here's a picture of the Moscow skyline. Again, there's been a lot of growth in the downtown area with lots of skyscrapers coming up. You see this clump of skyscrapers right close together. That used to be an old industrial site. And then the factory was torn down and the land was sold to developers. And then you have this large number of very tightly packed skyscrapers right in the downtown Moscow area. So this is the Moscow International Business Center, or IBC as it's sometimes called, in Moscow. So St. Petersburg is the second largest city in Russia. Moscow was a city that grew mostly in the 1500s. St. Petersburg is actually a little newer. It was founded in the 1700s. And it has lots of this great Baroque architecture, which was popular in the early 1700s. This picture on the left shows a map of the downtown. It has an old fortress on an island in the river in downtown St. Petersburg. And it also has a fantastic museum here. So the city has lots of great history and architecture to it. The pictures on the left is of a church and Capitol building, City Hall there. So here is a picture of the Peter and Paul Fortress, and this is a fortress that was built in the 1700s. And I mentioned earlier, in the Middle Ages, castles were built, large stone fortifications, but as cannons became more common in the 14 and 1500s, the castles became less strategically important because the walls could be knocked down by cannons. So starting in about the 1600s, fortifications were built lower to the ground and with lots of earth behind a barrier that would absorb cannons instead of being knocked down. So kind of like firing a BB gun into a bale of hay, these low walls with lots of dirt and earth behind them could absorb cannon fire. And this fortress here is an example of what fortresses in the 1700s were typically built like. And this is again Peter and Paul Fortress, and now it is part of the State Museum of St. Petersburg. So it's been converted into a museum. This is another museum, the Hermitage Museum, one of the largest and oldest museums in the world. The picture on the top right is of the Dutch room. The room is mostly of Dutch and Flemish art, and it's one of the finest collections of Dutch and Flemish art in the world. The picture on the top left is the museum from the outside, done in a beautiful Baroque fashion, very beautiful and ornate. And the picture on the bottom left is the inside of the building, and on the bottom right is a royal carriage that was used in the Palace of Versailles. So demographics of this region, this is an area that has relatively low population growth. There have been some attempts to reverse this, but generally it's persistently had a declining population, low fertility rates, high death rates, and especially in Russia, there's a fair amount of smoking and excessive drinking. That's a major health problem to Russia and the region. If you look at Russia 2014, you'll notice that starting fairly early on, you see a lot more women than men, and the higher up you get in the age bracket, starting at say 60, 65, you'll notice there are significantly more women than men, because women outlive men in Russia, even more so than in the US. And as you get to the very top, 85 and above, there are much fewer men than women, because so many men were killed during World War II. So starting even in the early 50s, women start outliving men, and there's a significant larger number of women than men in Russia. It is projected that by 2050, they could have an aging population, a lot of people in their 60s and above, and declining birth rates. So it could be narrower at the bottom with a smaller number of people below the age of 5 and a larger number of people in their 60s. So Russian men, heavy drinking is a problem in Russia. Russian men have a 25% chance of dying before they are 55 years old. So 1 in 4 Russian men die before 55. In the US, 1 in 11 men die before 55. So smoking and drinking is a serious health problem there. So Russia, in an attempt to reverse low population, has tried to adopt some incentives to encourage people to have more kids. The fertility rate of 2.1 is necessary to have a stable or slowly growing country. In the European Union, it's relatively low at 1.3, and in the US, it's a little bit higher at about 2.01, so just below 2.1. Russia in 2009 had a very low 1.34 fertility rate, and they wanted to increase that. So what they did is they had days off where you got the day off and you could go home, and they encouraged families to use this vacation day to have kids. Imagine if the president was saying, hey, take Labor Day off and start having kids. Well, that's kind of what they did in Russia. And they started giving away prizes. If you had a kid and you got pregnant, you could register to win a refrigerator or something crazy like that. They had a really aggressive ad campaign to encourage people to have more children, and it's actually been somewhat successful. As of 2016, the total fertility rate in Russia is 1.6 instead of 1.34. Some of this might have to do with a slightly better economy. Russia was making a fair amount of money off of natural gas and natural resources, but perhaps these incentives actually did play a role in it as well. Cultural coherence and diversity. This is a region that has a large group of Slavic people. That is a language family. That's an Indo-European language family. Russia is a Slavic language. The Caucasus region is especially culturally and linguistically complex. And the Russian Empire, as the Russian Empire expanded, it also brought the Russian language with it. So Russia is a very common language spoken in the region, sometimes as a primary language, sometimes as a secondary language. But it's a region that has a very large Slavic population and many Slavic languages spoken. So we mentioned a little earlier that Russia started kind of moving to the east, somewhat like Europeans moved to the west in our continent. This shows the expansion of the Russian people starting out around what is now Moscow in the red. And then in the Middle Ages, the Russians slowly expanded. And then in the 1500s, they started to move significantly and rapidly to the east. And then starting in the 1800s and 1900s, they moved into what is now Central Asia, into parts that eventually became part of the Soviet Union. Great Britain was concerned in the 1850s that Russia wanted to take over what is now India and Pakistan. So there was a lot of intrigue and conflict between Russia and Great Britain during the 1800s to see who would control what is now India and Pakistan. That was a very wealthy and productive colony for Great Britain until the mid-1900s when it gained its independence. So Russia started out as a rather small group of people around what is now Moscow, grew in the Middle Ages and rapidly grew in the 15 through 1800s. So here's a breakdown of some of the languages that are spoken in the region. Again, Slavic languages is a language family that includes Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, and that is the largest language family spoken. Some of the other languages spoken in the region that are non-Slavic are Romanian, Armenian, Altaic, and so on. So those are some of the lesser spoken languages in the region. Here's a little more information on the complexity of language in the area of Ukraine. There's a lot of conflict in the Ukraine shortly after the end of the 2014 Sochi Olympics. The Russian government sided with some people in Ukraine who were ethnically Russian who wanted to break away from Ukraine, and Russia gave them assistance in the form of military aid and intelligence and funding. And to this day, there's still a low-level civil war going on in Ukraine between the more Western-looking western part of Ukraine, which is mostly Ukrainian, non-Russian, and the more Russian-speaking, ethnically Russian eastern part that wants to have close ties to Russia. So the country is kind of split between some who want to look towards Western Europe for closer ties and the more ethnically Russian eastern part that wants to have closer ties to Russia. And this is the percent of speaking Russian as a native language. And as you can see, the further east you go, the more Russian speakers there are, and the further west you go, the fewer there are because they speak Ukrainian, which is Slavic and related to Russian, but not the same language. So here's a geography of the Caucasus region, and this, like the Balkans, is very fragmented and broken up between different ethnic groups and languages. In green, you have the Caucasian people, which are Georgians and other groups. In orange, you have Indo-Europeans, including Armenians, Greeks, Iranians, and Slavic people. And then in blue, you have Altaic people, which is a different language family made up of Mongols and Turks. And then you have some very sparsely populated mountainous or uninhabited regions. So it's a real melting pot of different ethnicities and different languages in the Caucasus region. So religion is an important thing in the region. It's overwhelmingly Eastern Orthodox with Muslim minorities in parts of the region. All religion during the Soviet Union was discouraged. The Soviet Union was officially an atheist state. You would get married in a city hall or a courthouse, not in a church. But after 1991, with the fall of the Soviet Union, Eastern Orthodox religions made a comeback, and now Eastern Orthodox religions has been embraced by the government, and Islam is also fairly common in parts of the region as well. So culturally, Russia has had some effect on the rest of the world, and it's been influenced by other parts of the world as well. In the Soviet days, there was an interesting artistic movement called socialist realism, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And there are some Russian celebrities in rock music, but I wouldn't say it's had a huge influence on the rest of the world. There are very few real popular Russian rock bands that I can think of. The biggest export from Russia is probably movie villains. It seems like every other movie in the last 15 years has had Russian villains. Even I think it's gotten a little ridiculous and out of hand how many Russians are villainized in movies. You think of any Liam Neeson, Denzel Washington movie, and they almost always seem to have Russian bad guys. But it's an area, it's a region that has been influenced by outside sources to some degree and had relatively modest influence on the rest of the world. Although Russia actually is probably best known for fantastic literature, a lot of really great Russian authors. So we talked about social or socialist realism, and this is a style of art that was common in the mid-20th century where socialist countries like the Soviet Union wanted to portray the benefits of the working man, and they wanted to show paintings of normal, regular people doing industrious, productive, meaningful things. So in the top left, you have a picture of Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union, meeting with young school children who are handing them flowers. The bottom left, you have some people kind of taking a break and having a picnic after working in the field. On the top right, you see a modern version of this. Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un's father in North Korea, is standing in front of a large globe with a bunch of his generals and advisors. And then an interesting picture of this style in the United States. On the bottom right, you have a Diego Rivera painting that is in the Detroit Institute of Arts that was made in 1932, commissioned by Henry Ford, where this Mexican artist who was somewhat influenced by this movement had a large mural of people working in a factory. Again, kind of the same idea, social and art that honored regular people who were working and doing something productive and contributing to society and to the state. So that's kind of what this style of art is. It's pretty interesting. It's a little on the nose as far as the propaganda is. I mean, there's not much subtle about the picture on the top right. It's pretty obvious the guy's trying to make himself look good, same with Stalin on the top left, but it's an interesting kind of art. So in the geopolitical framework, there's been growing instability across the region, especially in Ukraine and to some degree the Caucasus. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a great deal of chaos during the 1990s and a lot of crime and lawlessness. And that is partly what led to the rise of Vladimir Putin in 2000 when he became president. The Soviet Union just wanted some stability and normalcy, and Putin has kind of walked a fine line between improving the economy while still controlling, having a tight control over the government and having restrictions on freedom of speech and restrictions on freedom of the press and elections and so on. His strategy seems to be have just enough freedom of the press so people can't accuse him of being an outright tyrant, and have just enough elections so people can't claim that he's a dictator, but still have control of the press and politics. So in 2014, President Obama placed sanctions on Russia after they invaded the Ukraine as punishment, and that has significantly hurt the economy of Russia. So in the last 3 years, the economy of Russia has been hurting due to sanctions. And currently, our president, President Trump, is being investigated because it seems he and his sons might have had some contacts or collusions with Russia that helped him get elected. And the assumption perhaps was that if Putin helped get Trump elected, Trump would push to lessen sanctions on on Russia. Well, he has gotten elected. Whether it was because of any help from Putin is hard to say, probably not. But the sanctions have remained in place because even Republicans in Congress don't want to loosen sanctions on Russia. So at the moment, their economy has been hurting after 3 years of sanctions placed on it by the United States because they invaded the Ukraine. So geopolitical structure of the former Soviet Union. This picture shows Russia in yellow here, and then these other countries on the bottom are sometimes called the Stan countries. This is Central Asia, and these are countries that previously were part of the Soviet Union but became independent in the early 90s when they broke up. And then these countries here are countries that are considered to be part of this region that are still under close Russian influence. And then the Caucasus region is down here. So Russia is far and away the largest, the wealthiest, and most politically influential, and still a major regional power in the area. Although some of these Stan countries are trying to curry favor with Russia and China and try to maintain good relations with both of them instead of being too dependent on one of those two countries. So Kazakhstan especially is trying to have close ties to Russia and China so they're not too dependent on one of those two countries. So in the late 80s, we talked a little bit about the disintegration of the Soviet Union. That happened when in the mid to late 80s there were a series of reforms by Mikhail Gorbachev, the eighth and final leader of the Soviet Union, where he wanted to try to have more freedom of the press and a more open economy. And it was partially successful, but hardliners didn't want any reform, and many people who wanted reform thought the reform wasn't going fast enough. So in the early 1990s, he left office, and he was replaced by Boris Yeltsin. And Boris Yeltsin took over after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and he was president of Russia, or the Russian Federation, from 1991 to 1999. And this was a very difficult, chaotic time period where A lot of the state assets were being sold off to oligarchs under suspicious circumstances for probably less than they were worth. Lots of crime and kidnapping, a massive depression. The life expectancy in Russia actually declined by several years during this. The unemployment was similar to the U.S. during the Great Depression, very difficult and chaotic time, which is partly what led to the rise of Vladimir Putin. Boris Yeltsin was also seen as somewhat of a weak person. He was often seen publicly drunk, and he's kind of fat and out of shape, which is part of the reason why Vladimir Putin likes to portray this strong impression of himself being a strong leader. Some of the current political settings in the area, Moldova is fragmented. Recent elections in Moldova, you very often in this region have a split between those who want to look more towards the West and NATO and those who want to stay within the Russian sphere of influence. And that's a major issue throughout a lot of the countries in the region. Chechnya has had an independence movement trying to break away from Russia that was violently suppressed. Georgia has had relations between Georgia and Russia that has been very tense because of insurgent movements, countries wanting to have less influence, less Russian influence over them. So often a lot of countries in the area are trying to break away from Russian influence while others would like to remain under Russian influence. Ukraine, we talked a little bit about this earlier. In 2014, the Crimean Peninsula, a strategically important peninsula, was occupied by Russia. More or less, they just invaded it. And then in other parts of Ukraine, the ethnic Russian parts wanted to break away from the rest of the Ukraine and have closer ties with Russia or simply join Russia. And as you can see, areas in red are rebel-controlled zones. Areas in orange are rebel-proclaimed republics. So these are areas that want to break away from Ukraine and join Russia. And the rest is land that is still under Ukrainian control. So the level of violence has declined a little bit in this region. It's much lower than it is than compared to Syria, which is why we don't hear a lot about it. But there is still a low-level conflict in Ukraine between ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians. So again, there are 21 republics in the federation of what is now Russia today. And there has been a push for some local governments to have less control over them from Russia, from Moscow, from the central government. And there's been some push from Moscow to try to increase control. So there's a tension between local governments who want more autonomy and Putin and Russia wanting to have the president with more power. As we mentioned a little earlier, Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia in the 90s, was often out of shape and publicly drunk and somewhat of an embarrassment. And perhaps as a way of overcompensating for this, Vladimir Putin, who's actually kind of a small guy, he's about 5'4", he often likes to be seen doing tough, manly things. And he's riding shirtless on a horse, and he's shooting tigers, and he's playing hockey. He had an exhibition match where, astonishingly, he scored 7 goals against professional hockey players. That's pretty amazing. And here he's on a submarine. And again, this is it's pretty obvious propaganda trying to make him look tough. And because of that, he's kind of the target of a lot of internet mockery. Here you have pictures of Vladimir Putin riding a shark, riding a comet, riding an armored polar bear, riding an eagle, which is only slightly more ridiculous than the actual pictures he's been doing. So Russia has been challenged with, people have been complaining that under Putin, there's been a lack of civil liberties and a lack of free speech. There's been a band called Pussy Riot that actually sings in English that was critical of Vladimir Putin and actually thrown in jail for a brief period of time. And it just shows an example of the limitations of freedom of speech that they currently have in Russia and the broad support that this sometimes has. A lot of the Russian population remember the chaos of the 90s, remember the prestige and power they had during the Cold War, and they want to sometimes go back to those times, and they don't really like people complaining about the government or demanding more rights or open elections. They just want stability more than they want freedom of speech. So there's a tension in the press and among artists in this region who want more freedom of speech and a government who is putting tighter restrictions on it. So Russia has been worked since, I'd say about the late 1990s to have closer relations with China. They have had some territorial disputes with Japan, especially in the Kuril Islands, and they're concerned about NATO that's been expanding eastward closer to their border. Poland, which was under strong Russian influence, broke away and unequivocally faced towards the west and became a more Western European country. They've integrated themselves into the European Union, and they want nothing to do with Russia at all. And they have had no bones about that. So they're an example of a country that joined NATO, and this has antagonized Russia to some degree. Russia has had increasing global influence, and that's probably increased even more since the election of Donald Trump. Time magazine said Vladimir Putin was the most powerful person in the world, and Trump was second. That's according to Time magazine. So it's a country that wants to try to flex its muscle and have as much influence around the world as possible. The dispute that Russia is in with Japan is very interesting. There are some very strategically located islands in the northern part of Japan that right at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union invaded and took from Japan. And at the time, they were our allies, and Japan was, of course, the enemy that we were fighting against, so we didn't think much of it. But then during the Cold War, Russia turned these islands into a base where they could monitor submarine activity and deny the U.S. and Japan from using to monitor their sub-activity. So these islands are very strategically important because they can be used to listen in on and monitor submarine activity in this region of the ocean in the Pacific. So they're strategically very important. Japan would like to get these islands back, but Russia sees nothing to be gained by that, so they've refused to give them back. Here's some of the economic might of the area. As you can see here, there's lots of coal in Russia, lots of natural gas, vast amounts of natural resources. And as you can see here, you see the Trans-Siberian Railway linking the area together and providing a outlet to the Pacific Ocean for exports. So it's a vast area with lots of natural resources that is not being fully utilized because, of course, of the sanctions that have been placed on them. So during the Soviet Union, there was a tremendous amount of centralized planning where the government controlled almost everything. Roads were centrally planned and so on, rail lines, canals, and this often led to ineffective agriculture. The government trying to micromanage farming often led to reduced production compared to how it could have been. And they also, because they didn't have to make goods that they sold to consumers, the quality of the goods made was often rather poor. Americans can shop around for a better car, better whatever, but in the Soviet Union, you would only buy what the government built and gave to you, and often the quality of the products were poor. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there have been many attempts at reform, and some of them have been successful, but some of them have also been a cause of concern because of the large amount of corruption, and there's very little distinction between criminal activity and the government and intelligence agencies in Russia. They're often very interconnected. So when people have tried to reform Russian politics and reduce corruption, often the reforms are quickly eroded. This political cartoon on the bottom left shows people unrolling the reforms and people rolling up the reforms with corruption behind them. So in the United States, our current Secretary of State, Tillerson, was an ExxonMobil executive, a very wealthy and powerful oil company that did a lot to help Russia tap into and industrialize its oil and natural gas productions. Tillerson, while he was working at Exxon, in fact, did so much to help Russia to help develop their oil and their natural gas for exports that he was given a very high honor. He was given an award, basically kind of like the Congressional Medal of Honor, but from Russia. So he has very close ties to Russia, and he has known Vladimir Putin long before he became Secretary of State. So there's a long history of our current Secretary of State and his ties with Russia when he worked for Exxon. So globalization and Russia's petrol economy, because of sanctions, they're not exporting as much oil and natural gas as they were. but they had an extensive network of oil pipelines that they would use to export oil and natural gas to different markets. These are just some examples of that. Um, they had a lot of pipelines that went through the Caucasus and went through parts of Central Asia, but these areas were politically unstable, so they've recently been kind of shifting their gaze eastward and trying to export a lot of the raw materials to the east instead of moving it through Central Asia. Um, Even before sanctions, though, the cost and value of oil and natural gas started declining in about 2010, 2011 because of the vast increase of oil and natural gas from North America because of fracking. So oil and natural gas is not worth what it was, say, 6 to 10 years ago. And this is an area that still has kind of traditional ideas of the role of women in politics and so on. There are a lot of, interestingly enough, during the Soviet era, women were expected to get an education and go into science and so on. So in some ways, during the Soviet Union, the role of women was probably slightly better than it is now. Now, it's an area that has kind of a conservative, a patriarchal attitude towards women, and there's been problems with violence against women and human trafficking and so on. But with that said, we've had the same problems here in the United States as well. We've heard a lot about the Me Too movement, about how women have had to endure sexual harassment, and we're learning a lot more about that. So you could say in Russia, their attitudes towards women and the role of women are not a lot different than what they might be here in the U.S., with some women working outside the home and some women having a more traditional role, and sometimes women getting pushed back by a patriarchal society. So let's do a couple review questions here. What is the name of the mountain range that extends from the Baltic Sea to the Caspian Sea? We've talked a little bit about this. This is a pretty tall mountain range, and that would be the Caucasus Mountains. The Alps are in northern Italy and Switzerland. The Andes are in South America. Himalayas are in Asia, and the Rockies, of course, are in North America. So these are a mountain range that have a large difference of ethnic groups and languages spoken around the region. And they're very tall. Some of them are up to 18,000 feet, some of the taller mountains in this region. So which climate classification dominates the Russian domain? That is D, continental mid-latitude, and that means they have 4 distinct seasons. They're usually far away from the moderating effects of the ocean, and they have typically warm summers, depending on how far north you are, cool to cold winters, and it has a climate similar to what we would have here in Michigan. In which country is there west-east divide between Catholics and Orthodox Christians? And we talked a little bit about that in this presentation. It's talked about in the book a little more extensively, and that is Ukraine. In Ukraine, the Ukrainians to the western 2/3 of the country are overwhelmingly Catholic, and the ethnic Russians in the eastern third roughly are more Orthodox, Russian Orthodox Church, and this can cause some tensions. Based on this map, which of the following resources is most prevalent in Siberia? Of course, Siberia again is this large region here, roughly the eastern 2/3 of the region, very lightly populated, and that would be coal. All those little coal carts there represent coal. Of Russia's many natural resources, which of the following most attracts foreign investment? And that would be natural gas. Coal and lumber and gold have attracted some foreign investment, but natural gas has attracted a significant amount of foreign investment from companies such as Exxon or others. Natural gas is used to heat homes and to generate electricity, but usually natural gas, the biggest use for it is for heating homes. The most significant environmental threat in northern Ukraine is nuclear pollution. This is near the Chernobyl accident that happened in 1986. There's a lot of nuclear power that was in this area, so it's an area that suffers from nuclear pollution. One of the legacies of communist planning in cities is environmental pollution. Communists typically just didn't care that much about the environment. They were trying to keep up with the United States during the Cold War and to have protections on the environment they thought would cost money and slow them down. and individuals had very little recourse against pollution. You couldn't sue if someone devalued your property with pollution because then you couldn't own property. So the Soviet Union led a legacy of environmental pollution behind. If you have any questions, send me an email. Otherwise, I look forward to looking at your quizzes and your different assignments. I've enjoyed looking over them so far, and we will deal with the Far East, the Southeast, and Southeastern Asia in the few chapters coming up.